The drizzle fell with a tired, gray indifference, coating the cracked asphalt of the Value Mart parking lot in a slick, greasy film. It was the kind of rain that didn't wash things clean but merely moved the dirt around. For Sarah, it felt like a mirror to her life. She pushed the wobbly shopping cart, one wheel squeaking a frantic, rhythmic complaint against the pavement. Inside, the meager haul represented a week of careful calculations, of pennies stretched into dimes, of forgoing her own meals so her son, Leo, could have his. A gallon of milk, a loaf of store-brand bread, a small package of ground beef, and nestled in the corner a tiny 6-inch circular cake in a plastic dome. The frosting was a chemical blue, the piped-on letters of Happy Birthday already starting to weep sugary tears. It was pathetic, she knew, but it was all she could afford for Leo's 8th birthday tomorrow. He'd asked for nothing, a learned habit of a child who understood the silent language of scarcity, and that silence broke her heart more than any request ever could. Her hands, chapped and red from her dishwashing job at the local diner, gripped the cart's handle until her knuckles were white. The chill of the evening air seeped through her thin jacket, a threadbare hand-me-down that had lost its fight with the cold years ago. She was exhausted down to her bones, a deep, cellular weariness that came from fighting a war on too many fronts: grief, poverty, and the crushing loneliness of single motherhood. As she navigated toward her rust-pocked sedan, a shape detached itself from the shadows of the store's overhang. Rick. He was a permanent fixture in this part of town, a man whose ambition had peaked at being the biggest predator in the smallest pond. He moved with a lazy, swaggering confidence, flanked by 2 equally aimless cronies who orbited him like dull moons. His eyes, small and dark, scanned her cart with a sneer that was both practiced and genuine. "Look what we got here," he drawled, his voice a gravelly rumble that grated on the nerves. "Little mommy bird stocking up the nest," his friends snickered, a hollow, unpleasant sound. Sarah kept her head down, her gaze fixed on the broken yellow line of a parking space. The mantra she repeated daily, "Don't engage, don't be seen, just get home," thumped in her chest like a panicked drum. She tried to steer the cart around him, a silent plea to be left alone. He sidestepped, blocking her path. The cart wobbled to a halt, its squeaky wheel falling silent, making the sudden quiet feel loud and threatening. "What's the hurry?" Rick taunted, leaning in. He smelled of stale cigarettes and cheap beer. "Too good to say hello to your neighbors?" He reached into her cart, his grimy hand closing around the plastic bag containing the milk and bread. She flinched, a small, involuntary movement. He saw it and his grin widened, a predator delighting in the fear of its prey. With a flick of his wrist, he tossed the bag to one of his friends. Then his eyes landed on the cake. "Oh, a party," he cooed with mock delight. "Am I invited?" Before she could react, he snatched the flimsy plastic bag containing the cake and a few other items. He held it up to the weak, flickering parking lot lights as if inspecting a prize. "Look at this sad thing. You call this a cake?" He laughed, a harsh, barking sound that echoed in the damp air. Sarah finally looked up, her voice a fragile whisper. "Please, that's for my son's birthday." The plea was a mistake. It was a confirmation of her vulnerability, the exact thing he fed on. "Your son," Rick scoffed, his face twisting into a mask of theatrical pity. "Kid probably wishes he had a different mom, one who could afford a real cake." The words were a physical blow, striking the rawest of her insecurities. Humiliation washed over her, hot and suffocating. In that moment, he wasn't just a thug. He was the voice of every doubt she had about herself, every fear that she was failing her son. With a final, contemptuous smirk, he deliberately loosened his grip on the thin plastic bag. The weight of a can of beans did the rest. The bag tore open, its contents spilling onto the wet, oil-stained ground. The milk carton hit with a dull thud but didn't break. The bread landed in a puddle, instantly turning to a soggy pulp. But the cake, her small, desperate symbol of love for Leo, landed face down. The plastic dome cracked, and the pathetic blue frosting smeared across the asphalt in a tragic, greasy swirl. Rick and his friends roared with laughter. It was the cruelest sound she had ever heard. The world around her seemed to tunnel. The other shoppers hurrying to their cars, the ones who had seen the whole exchange, now moved with a new urgency. Their heads down, their gazes averted. They were ghosts, disappearing into the anonymity of their own lives, leaving her alone in the spotlight of her shame. Rick kicked at the ruined cake, grinding it further into the pavement with the heel of his boot. "Happy birthday, kid," he spat, before turning and ambling away with his friends, the stolen bag of milk and bread swinging from his hand like a trophy. Sarah stood frozen, surrounded by the wreckage of her small victory at the checkout line. The drizzling rain began to fall harder, mingling with the silent tears that now tracked paths through the grime on her cheeks. She was not just robbed. She was erased. Her struggle, her effort, her love for her son. It had all been rendered worthless and pathetic, a joke for a bored bully in a forgotten parking lot. She remained motionless for a long time, the cold seeping into her bones, her mind a maelstrom of shame and fury. The laughter of Rick and his friends still echoed in her ears, a soundtrack to her degradation. Passers-by continued to ignore her, their avoidance a form of silent complicity. A woman with a cart full of groceries maneuvered carefully around the puddle of spoiled food, her expression a careful blank mask. A man unlocking his truck glanced at her, then quickly looked away, as if her despair were contagious. Each averted gaze was another small cut, deepening the wound of her isolation. She was invisible, less than invisible. She was an inconvenience, a mess to be stepped around. Rick and his cronies had settled onto a concrete retaining wall nearby, under the meager shelter of a dying tree. They were drinking from paper-bagged bottles, their voices loud and obnoxious, occasionally glancing over at her to renew their amusement. They were celebrating their power, the cheap and easy dominance they held over this small, bleak corner of the world. For them, she was no longer a person. She was a story they would tell, a punchline about the pathetic woman and her smashed cake. Her worth had been publicly denied, stripped away and trampled on the ground along with the groceries. The sight of the blue frosting, now a muddy smear on the blacktop, was what finally broke through her paralysis. It was such a small thing, a cheap confection of sugar and dye, but it had represented so much more. It was her attempt to build a tiny island of joy for Leo in their vast ocean of hardship. It was her defiance against the relentless grind of their life. And Rick hadn't just destroyed it, he had reveled in its destruction. He had taken pleasure in reminding her that in his world, people like her didn't get to have even the smallest of celebrations. Her hands trembled as she bent down, her knees protesting as they met the cold, wet ground. She began to gather the salvageable items. The can of beans was dented but usable. The carton of milk, miraculously, was intact. But the bread was a lost cause, and the cake. The cake was just a memory now. As she picked up the cracked plastic dome, a shard of it pricked her finger. She watched a single drop of blood well up, a tiny crimson star against her pale skin. It was a strange, grounding sensation. The pain was real, sharp, and clear. It cut through the fog of humiliation and sparked something else inside her. Something hard and resilient that had been dormant for too long. This quiet, stubborn strength was a legacy, a gift from a man who had been the center of her world. Her husband, Mark. The thought of him was a painful ache, a phantom limb she still reached for in the dark. Mark was a Marine, a man built of discipline and quiet honor. He wasn't a large man, but he moved with a certainty that made him seem to take up more space in the world. He had died 5 years ago, his armored vehicle hitting an IED on a dusty road thousands of miles from home. He had left behind a folded flag, a box of medals, and a hole in her life so vast it threatened to swallow her whole. Before the Marines, Mark had been part of a small, local motorcycle club, the Sentinels. They weren't an outlaw gang, but a close-knit group of veterans and working-class men who found brotherhood in the roar of an engine and the loyalty of a shared patch. They lived by a code. It wasn't written down, but it was understood as deeply as scripture. You protect your own. You stand your ground. You never, ever let a bully win by showing them your tears. He had taught her that. "Dignity, Sarah," he used to say, his hands gently framing her face. "It's the one thing nobody can take from you unless you give it to them. When they push, you don't just push back. You stand firm. You let them break themselves against you." He had a quiet confidence that she had always admired, a bedrock of self-respect that seemed unshakable. After he died, the world had pushed hard. The military benefits were a tangled mess of bureaucracy. Her in-laws, who had never approved of their son marrying a townie, offered condolences but no support. The life they had been building together crumbled to dust, and she was left to sweep up the pieces with a 6-year-old boy who had just lost his hero. She took the dishwashing job because it was the only one she could get without a degree, the late hours allowing her to be there for Leo after school. Every day was a battle against eviction notices, against the gnawing anxiety of an empty pantry, against the pitying looks from other parents at school functions. She was fighting to keep not just their bodies fed, but their spirits from starving. That's what the cake was about. It was a symbol of Mark's philosophy. It was her standing firm, refusing to let poverty rob her son of the simple dignity of a birthday. And now, kneeling on the cold asphalt, she could almost hear his voice, a low, steady murmur beneath the sound of the rain. "Get up, Sarah. Don't let him have this. Don't let him see you broken." The pressure was immense, a physical weight on her shoulders. Go home. Lock the door. Cry into a pillow where no one can see. Take the defeat and hide from it. That was the easy path, the one her exhaustion screamed for her to take. The community around her had already made its choice. Silence. The cashier who had rung up her groceries, a young woman with tired eyes, was now staring out the front window of the Value Mart, her expression unreadable before she turned away to help another customer. No one was coming to help. No one was going to intervene. The social contract, the unspoken agreement that people should look out for one another, had been declared null and void in this parking lot. Her problem was hers alone. Rick and his friends were still laughing, their bravado fueled by her inaction. Their continued presence was a challenge, a taunt. They were waiting for the second act of their little drama, the part where the victim scurries away in tears. They wanted to see her defeated spirit as proof of their power. To leave now would be to give them exactly what they wanted. It would be an admission that they were right, that she was worthless, that her dignity was as easily disposed of as a cheap cake. She thought of Leo, waiting at home, probably watching the clock, wondering where she was. If she went home now, broken and empty-handed, what would she tell him? That the world was cruel and they were its victims? That bullies always win? The lessons she was trying to teach him, lessons of kindness, of resilience, of holding your head high, would ring hollow. She would be teaching him the opposite with her actions. She would be teaching him to be afraid. The memory of Mark was a fire in her belly. He had faced down men with guns. He had walked into danger for his country, for his brothers, for the idea of a world where bullies didn't get to win. And here she was, in a rainy parking lot, facing a petty tyrant who wielded cruelty as his only weapon. The fight was different, the scale smaller, but the principle was the same. Dignity is the one thing they can't take unless you give it to them. Her hands stopped shaking. A strange, cold calm settled over her. She placed the dented can and the milk carton back into the wobbly cart. She left the ruined bread and the smeared cake on the ground, a testament to the conflict. Slowly, deliberately, she rose to her feet. Her back was straight, her chin lifted. She was no longer a victim cowering on the ground. She was Mark's wife. She was Leo's mother. And she was done being invisible. The pressure from the world's indifference had failed to crush her. Instead, it had forged her resolve into something sharp and unyielding. With a deep breath that tasted of rain and exhaust fumes, she began to walk, not toward her car, but toward Rick. Each step was measured, purposeful. The squeaky wheel of her empty cart was the only sound she made, a lonely, defiant rhythm against the backdrop of the falling rain. Rick's laughter faltered as he saw her approaching. His friends fell silent, their amusement replaced by a flicker of confusion. They had expected her to flee. This was not part of their script. Her face was a placid mask, revealing nothing of the storm raging inside her. She wasn't angry, not anymore. The anger had burned away, leaving behind a core of pure, cold resolve. She stopped a few feet from their makeshift throne on the concrete wall. She looked directly at Rick, her gaze steady and unwavering. He shifted uncomfortably, his swagger momentarily deserting him. He was a predator, and predators are unsettled by prey that does not act like prey. She didn't speak. Instead, she reached into the pocket of her thin jacket. Her fingers closed around the crumpled bills and loose change that were left. $4.63. It was her gas money, the funds meant to get her to and from work for the rest of the week. Without it, she would have to walk. It was, in that moment, everything she had. Slowly, she extended her hand. She didn't throw the money at him or offer it with a trembling, submissive gesture. She simply held it out, her palm open. Rick stared at her hand, then at her face, his brow furrowed. "What's this?" he grunted, his voice laced with suspicion. Sarah's voice, when it came, was quiet but carried a surprising weight. It was clear and steady, devoid of fear or pleading. "You must need this more than I do." She didn't wait for him to take it. With a grace that seemed utterly out of place in the grimy parking lot, she stepped forward and placed the crumpled bills and the handful of coins on the damp concrete wall beside his leg. The act was profound in its simplicity. It wasn't charity. It wasn't surrender. It was a judgment. It was a quiet, devastating declaration that his soul was so impoverished, his character so bankrupt, that he was the one who was truly in need. She had reframed the entire encounter. He was not the powerful thief. He was a pathetic beggar, so desperate for a sense of control that he had to steal joy from a child. Her action was a mirror, and in it he was reflected not as a tough guy, but as something small and pitiable. The air crackled with a new kind of tension. Rick's friends stared, their smirks gone, replaced by expressions of disbelief. Rick himself looked as if she had slapped him. He was built for physical confrontation, for shouted insults and tearful pleas. He had no defense against this. He had no weapon to combat quiet dignity. Sarah held his gaze for a second longer, a silent transfer of power passing between them. Then, without another word, she turned her back on him. She walked back to her empty cart, gripped its handle, and began the slow, steady push toward her car. She had lost her groceries. She had lost her son's birthday cake. But as she walked away, she felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. She felt tall. From a weathered bench under the relative dryness of the Value Mart's covered walkway, an old man had watched the entire scene unfold. His name was Arthur, but everyone in the neighborhood just called him Pops. He was a Vietnam vet, a man whose face was a roadmap of hard years and whose eyes held a deep, weary wisdom. He sat on that bench most evenings, nursing a lukewarm coffee, observing the small dramas of the world go by. He had seen Sarah before, had noted the quiet resilience in her posture, the way she carried her burdens without complaint. He had also seen Rick and his crew, and he understood the casual, thoughtless cruelty of men like them all too well. When Rick had snatched the groceries, Pops had felt a familiar, angry heat rise in his chest. He'd started to push himself up, his old joints groaning in protest, ready to say something, to do something, even if it was just to be a witness who didn't look away. But then he saw the look on Sarah's face as she knelt on the pavement. He saw the flicker of despair, and then the slow, miraculous hardening of her resolve. He watched, transfixed, as she walked over to Rick. He couldn't hear her words, but he didn't need to. The act of placing the money on the wall was a piece of theater so powerful, so pure in its message, that it needed no dialogue. It was the most courageous thing he had seen in years. A slow, deep nod of respect was his immediate, involuntary reaction. This woman, this quiet, unassuming mother, had more backbone than a whole platoon. She was a warrior, fighting with a weapon Rick couldn't even comprehend. As Sarah walked away, leaving Rick and his friends stunned into silence, Pops reached into the pocket of his worn flannel jacket and pulled out an old, beat-up flip phone. His gnarled fingers, stiff with arthritis, moved with a practiced slowness, dialing a number he hadn't called in years but knew by heart. The phone was answered on the second ring. "Yeah," a gruff voice answered. "Preacher," Pop said, his own voice low and raspy. "It's Arthur." There was a pause on the other end, then a note of recognition and respect. "Pops, it's been a while. Everything okay?" "I'm fine," Pop said, his eyes still fixed on Sarah as she reached her car. "But I just saw something that wasn't. Do you remember Mark Sanderson? Marine. Rode with the Sentinels before he shipped out." Another pause, shorter this time. "I remember Mark. Good man. Solid. What about him?" Pops took a slow breath, the story ready. "I'm looking at his widow right now. Some local trash just humiliated her in the Valu-Mart parking lot. Robbed her. Smashed her kid's birthday cake on the ground for a laugh." He relayed the rest of the story in brief, clipped sentences. The public shaming, the averted eyes of the bystanders, and finally, Sarah's incredible act of defiance. He didn't embellish. He didn't have to. The facts were potent enough. When he was finished, the line was silent for a long moment. Pops could almost feel the cold fury building on the other end. The Hells Angels and the Sentinels weren't officially allied, but in the tight-knit world of military vets and serious bikers, there were unspoken lines of respect. Mark Sanderson had been one of the respected ones. A soldier's widow was, by an unwritten extension of that code, sacrosanct. To harm one was to insult the memory of all who had served and fallen. "Where are you, Pops?" Preacher's voice was dangerously calm. "Valu-Mart on 9th Street, Pops replied. "The punk's name is Rick. Lives in the rundown apartment block across the street. Unit 2B. He won't be hard to find." "Stay there," Preacher commanded. "We're on our way." The line went dead. Pops flipped his phone shut and slipped it back into his pocket. The dynamic in the parking lot had already shifted. Rick, having recovered some of his bluster, had kicked the money Sarah had left onto the ground, trying to reclaim his dominance. But the act felt hollow, petulant. A few people who had witnessed the exchange from their cars were now whispering to each other, pointing not at Sarah, but at Rick. The whispers of respect for her were beginning, and the whispers of contempt for him were taking root. The air itself seemed to be holding its breath, waiting. A low, distant rumble, almost subliminal at first, began to vibrate through the soles of Pop's worn-out boots. It was a sound he knew well. It was the sound of thunder on a clear day. It was the sound of judgment coming. The rumble grew steadily, a deep-throated growl that seemed to rise from the earth itself. It was more than a sound. It was a physical presence, a vibration that rattled the windows of the Valu-Mart and made the loose change in Rick's pocket buzz against his thigh. He and his friends looked up from their beers, their expressions of smug satisfaction dissolving into confusion, then alarm. The sound was coming from all directions at once, a symphony of internal combustion that was both terrifying and magnificent. Then the first one appeared, a Harley-Davidson, chromed and black, a beast of a machine, rounded the corner onto 9th Street. Its headlight cut a sharp, white cone through the deepening twilight. It was followed immediately by another, then two more, then a whole phalanx of them, their engines thundering in perfect, menacing unison. They poured into the street like a river of steel and leather, an invading army taking the territory. They were Hell's Angels, not a small chapter, but a massive show of force. The lead bike was ridden by a man with a long, graying beard and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. He wore a leather vest or a cut, adorned with the iconic Death's head patch and a smaller one above it that read, "President." This was Preacher. He raised a single gloved hand, and with the precision of a military drill team, the bikes began to peel off, lining the curb in front of the dilapidated apartment building where Rick lived. One by one, they cut their engines, the sudden silence punctuated by the ticking and cooling of hot metal. But they didn't stop coming. More bikes filled the street behind them, blocking traffic in both directions. Car horns blared once or twice in protest, then fell silent as their drivers saw the sheer, overwhelming number of leather-clad men. 10 bikes became 20, then 40, then 60, then 70. They formed a silent, intimidating wall, a gauntlet of chrome and hardened glares that completely sealed off the block. Rick and his friends were frozen, their faces pale in the combined glare of 70 headlights now aimed directly at them. The cheap beer bottles slipped from their nerveless fingers, shattering on the concrete. The small kingdom they ruled, this tiny patch of asphalt, had just been occupied by a force they couldn't possibly comprehend. This wasn't a fight. It was an extinction-level event. Preacher swung his leg over his bike, his heavy boots making a solid, authoritative sound on the pavement. He moved with a slow, deliberate purpose that radiated power. He ignored Rick completely, his eyes scanning the area until they found Pops, still sitting on his bench. He walked over, the crowd of bikers parting silently to let him through. He stopped in front of the old veteran, his massive frame casting a long shadow. "Pops," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He nodded his head in a gesture of profound respect. "You look good. You look like you brought the whole damn army?" Pops rasped back, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "Mark Sanderson's wife," Preacher stated, not as a question, but as a confirmation. "That's her?" Pops said, gesturing with his chin towards Sarah, who was standing by her car, key in hand, watching the impossible scene unfold with wide, disbelieving eyes. The one with all the sand in her gut. Preacher's gaze shifted to Sarah. It was an intense, piercing look, but it held no malice. It was an assessment. He saw the threadbare jacket, the exhaustion in her posture, but he also saw the straightness of her spine and the defiant tilt of her chin. He saw the warrior Pops had described. The name Mark Sanderson had already spread through the ranks like wildfire. Whispers of "It's Mark's widow" and "Marine from the 1st Battalion" rippled through the sea of bikers. Mark had been a legend in certain circles, a man who had once single-handedly defended a VFW post from a group of thugs much like Rick, earning the lasting respect of every club in the state. He was not one of them, but he was a brother in a different uniform, and that bond was sacred. The debt of honor owed to a fallen soldier was absolute. Preacher turned his attention back to Pops. "Tell me again what happened." Pops recounted the story once more, his voice steady, his details precise. He spoke of the mockery, the stolen food, the deliberate, cruel destruction of the birthday cake. He ended with Sarah's quiet, powerful act of defiance, placing her last few dollars before the thug. As he spoke, a cold, dangerous silence settled over the assembled bikers. Their faces, already hard, became masks of controlled fury. This was not just an insult to a woman. It was a desecration of a sacred code. They were the guardians of a certain kind of old-world honor, and a line had been crossed. When Pops finished, Preacher gave a single, slow nod. He then walked toward Sarah. She watched him approach, her heart hammering against her ribs. He was an intimidating figure, a giant of a man covered in tattoos and leather, but as he got closer, she saw something in his eyes that wasn't threatening. It was a look of profound, almost sorrowful respect. "Ma'am," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "I'm Preacher. I knew your husband. Not well, but I knew his reputation." He was a man of honor. Sarah could only nod, words failing her. The mention of Mark's name from this stranger was both a comfort and a fresh wave of grief. "We heard what happened here," Preacher continued, his gaze flicking for a moment toward Rick, who was now trying to shrink into the concrete wall. "No one gets to treat the widow of a Marine like that. Not in this town. Not while we're still breathing." He didn't need her testimony. The truth had already been delivered by Pops, and it was corroborated by the legacy of the man she had loved. The bikers weren't here for an investigation. They were here to balance the scales. The truth had been revealed, and now justice would be served. The punishment, when it came, was not what anyone expected. There was no violence, no brutal beating. Preacher and his men understood that physical pain was temporary. What they intended to deliver was something far more lasting: psychological dread and public emasculation. Preacher turned to face his men. He didn't shout an order. He simply pointed a single gloved finger at Rick's apartment building. The message was clear. 70 men remained by their bikes, a silent, unmoving wall of judgment. Their engines stayed off, but their presence was louder than any engine's roar. It was a siege. They were a living monument to Rick's transgression, a public declaration that he was now a marked man. Every neighbor peeking through their blinds, every car that was rerouted around the blocked-off street, every person in the Value Mart parking lot would know what happened here. They would know that this small-time bully had made a catastrophic mistake. Preacher then turned to a younger biker with a prospect patch on his vest. "Roadkill," he said. "The lady lost her groceries. Fix it." The prospect nodded once, then motioned to 3 other bikers. They strode into the Value Mart with a purpose that made every employee and customer step aside. Minutes later, they emerged with 4 shopping carts, each one overflowing with bags. They hadn't just replaced what was lost. They had bought her a month's worth of food. Steaks, fresh vegetables, brand-name cereals, everything she never allowed herself to buy. Another biker, a grizzled man with a scar down his cheek, had been sent on a different errand. He returned from the bakery down the street carrying a large, ornate box. He presented it to Preacher, who, in turn, offered it to Sarah. "Ma'am," he said, "we can't replace the cake you bought, but we hope this will do." Sarah opened the box. Inside was a magnificent, 2-tiered birthday cake, expertly decorated with blue frosting, a deep, royal blue, and the words, "Happy 8th Birthday," Leo written in perfect, elegant script. It was the most beautiful cake she had ever seen. Tears she had refused to shed for Rick now welled in her eyes, tears of overwhelming gratitude. Then Preacher did something that stunned every biker present. He reached up to his own cut, to the patch on the left breast that read "Property of Hell's Angels" with a small, sharp knife. He carefully cut the threads holding it in place. This was not a patch given to outsiders. It was a sacred symbol of belonging, of protection. He held it out to her in his open palm. "This isn't a membership," he explained, his voice low and serious. "It's a message. You show this if anyone ever gives you trouble again. You tell them to call me. It means you're family. It means you're under our protection. Mark was a brother. That makes you a sister and your boy a nephew. No one touches family." Sarah took the patch, its thick embroidered threads feeling heavy and substantial in her hand. It was more than a piece of cloth. It was a shield. It was a promise. From his second-story window, Rick watched it all. He saw the groceries, the cake, the handing over of the patch. He saw his own powerlessness reflected in the stoic faces of the 70 men below. He hadn't just provoked a biker club. He had violated a code he didn't even know existed. He was no longer a predator. He was a pariah in his own neighborhood, a man living on borrowed time under the watchful, unforgiving eyes of an army. The bikers had stripped him of his reputation and his power without throwing a single punch. They had recognized Sarah's dignity and, in doing so, had annihilated his. The bikers didn't just leave the groceries on the curb. "Let's get you home, ma'am," Preacher said. It wasn't a question. A path was cleared, and Sarah was gently guided to her car. Preacher and 2 of the largest bikers rode in front of her, and the other 67 fell in behind. It was the most intimidating and honorable escort imaginable. As the procession of 73 vehicles, 72 Harleys and 1 rust-pocked sedan, made its way through the quiet residential streets, people came out of their houses. They stood on their porches and lawns, their faces a mixture of confusion, fear, and awe. The neighbors who had only ever given Sarah looks of pity or mild disdain now saw her in a completely new light. She wasn't the poor, struggling single mom anymore. She was the woman being escorted home by an army of leather-clad guardians. Her status in the community was being rewritten in real time, with every thunderous rotation of a V-twin engine. When they arrived at her small, humble apartment complex, the bikers dismounted with practiced efficiency. They formed 2 lines from her car to her front door, creating a corridor of honor. Several of them took the dozens of grocery bags, their large, tattooed arms laden with food, and carried them up the stairs for her. They were silent and respectful, moving with a surprising gentleness. Inside her small apartment, the bikers saw the life she had built. It was sparse, but impeccably clean. On a small end table was a single, framed photograph. Mark, young and handsome in his marine dress blues, his arm wrapped around a smiling, vibrant Sarah. It was a picture from another lifetime. Seeing it, the bikers understood everything. They weren't just protecting a stranger. They were honoring the memory of a fallen brother by looking after the world he had left behind. After the last grocery bag was placed on her kitchen counter, the bikers filed out, their mission complete. Preacher was the last to leave. He stood in her doorway, filling the frame. "The town knows who you are now," he said, his voice a quiet vow. "They know who you belong to. You or the boy ever need anything at all, you use that patch. You call." He gave her a number. It was not a casual offer. It was a binding contract. Sarah, holding the patch in one hand and the bakery box in the other, could only whisper, "Thank you." It felt like too small a word for the immense gift she had been given. It wasn't about the food or the cake. It was about the restoration of her dignity, the return of a feeling she thought she had lost forever, the feeling of being safe. Preacher simply nodded, then turned and walked down the stairs. A moment later, a single command was shouted. 70 engines roared to life in a deafening, synchronized chorus. It was a sound that shook the entire building. But to Sarah, it was no longer threatening. It was the sound of loyalty. It was the sound of a promise being kept. She watched from her doorway as the 70 motorcycles pulled away, their red taillights disappearing into the night, leaving behind only the smell of exhaust and the profound silence of their absence. The door to the bedroom creaked open, and Leo appeared, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and wonder. "Who were all those noisy men, Mommy?" he asked. His gaze then fell to the enormous, beautiful cake in her hands. Sarah looked down at her son, then at the biker patch she clutched tightly. A genuine smile, the first she'd felt in years, spread across her face. "They were friends of your father's, sweetie," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "And they brought you a birthday cake, for the first time in a very long time." Standing in the doorway of her small apartment, Sarah felt like she was home. She wasn't alone anymore. She had a family again.